You and others have mentioned that when someone is compressed in the dorsal rostral thorax, dorsal rostral is the uppermost part of the posterior thorax. Usually it's like the first 6 ribs. And it's proven with your shoulder flexion assessment between the ranges of 60 to 120 degrees among other measures that you would intervene by reaching exercises below 60 degrees flexion in various positions depending on the ISA presentation. So if someone's limited in flexion, you'd go after lower posterior. We're with you so far. Is it possible that in this instance we could intervene with a position that includes reaching in the 60 to 120 degree range in the compressive ranges if we IR at the humerus? The question Corey's asking is, if you have someone who's limited in the 60 to 120 range, could you go after anterior expansion to help assist shoulder flexion? The short answer is yes. And this is where it gets kind of confusing because and even in that last part, I was talking, well, Zach, you need posterior expansion. Why in the hell are you now saying you could drive some anterior expansion? The answer has to do with the fact that we have to fill the rib cage up as a unit, really, to go overhead. So I want you to think of it as this wonderful, luscious Topo Chico bottle. When I fill the Topo Chico with that sweet, sweet nectar, that crispy goodness, it fills from the bottom up. I can't fill the bottom and then fill a little bit of the top and then have the space in the middle. So I have to have this bottom up fill in order for it to be filled with the luscious Topo Chico goodness. The same principle applies to the lungs when you're doing something like shoulder flexion. So in order for me to fill the bottom part of the lungs, I have to be able to get the stack first, and then I can choose activities that bias expansion in the lower part of the lungs, especially posteriorly. That's where doing your 0 to 60 reach is useful. How about this? In the 60 to 120 range, I may need to actually bias the anterior thorax in those same regions, and that's where reaching forward could go. And it's filling back side of the lower, front side of the lower, and then you would do the same with the uppers. So as you go up overhead, now I need to drive airflow into the uppermost segments of the thorax to get those to fill. And I really need that entire fill as I go through the arc of flexion. So in the lower ranges, if I can't acquire any external rotation at the humerus, I need to get posterior expansion. Now, if I can't get flexion in the mid ranges and I start to drive into IR, well, I need to actually have some posterior compression in order to make that motion happen. So that's where you could totally justify driving humeral internal rotation or anterior expansion to happen. How would you know where to go? And that's really the crux of this. The way that I sequence this is, for me to know if I need the lower posterior expansion, that's the first part that you need to perform shoulder flexion, to T6, T8 expansion. I'm going to generally have a loss of external rotation at the humerus if I can't expand there. So if you have a loss of ER, you're going to do things to then drive posterior expansion at T6 to T8. That's where your lower reaches would come into play. Let's say I clear that. Let's say I have full external rotation, and I'm not doing like a compensatory issue either, where I have like 130. Because just because you have that doesn't mean that you got full posterior expansion there. A lot of times the excessive motions are because of a major shape change or tilting in the posterior thorax. Let's say you've cleared ER, and there's some improvements in shoulder flexion, but they're still limited. You may actually need to drive anterior expansion in that case, especially if they can't get to 120. How would you know? You'd have a loss of shoulder internal rotation. Shoulder internal rotation deficits would indicate you'd need expansion in the anterior thorax at the same level, T6 to T8. So for that, you might consider doing straight reaches, 90 degrees, something like that. If you clear IR, you may actually see some improvements in shoulder flexion. So what I've done, this is all assuming that you got the stack, of course, which I'll link in the show notes. If you don't have it, then you can talk to me. So I get the stack. I filled the lower segments of the lungs, so I got posterior expansion, then I got anterior expansion at T6 to T8. Let's say you're still limited in shoulder flexion. You might have to move on up, like your favorite Jefferson's episode. So I move on up. I may need now upper posterior and anterior expansion of the thorax, and I would still attack it in that same order. How would you know if you need those segments? To determine if you need like T2 to T4 to expand, horizontal abduction posteriorly would be an indicator, and then anterior expansion would be horizontal adduction. Look at those. Things that I like to make that happen. You could drive like side-lying arm bars. I like those to get the anterior expansion, or posterior for that matter. Those seem to be very useful at making that happen. Also, driving trunk rotation is another great way to make the uppermost posterior or the uppermost segments expand. Inversion activities can also assist with that, as well as progressing your overhead action without losing the stack position. All of those can improve the uppermost expansion that we need to drive shoulder flexion. So if you do those, and you can clear horizontal AB and AD, a lot of times you'll see some very nice changes in shoulder flexion. But let's say you're still limited. You've cleaned all that stuff up. You might have to move on to the next most upper segment, which would be looking at lower cervical rotation. For that, I will approximate C7 to T1 in theory, and I'll rotate the neck as a unit. Sometimes if people are limited there, you still may need to create expansion in the uppermost posterior segments to complete shoulder flexion. For that, that's where you could drive some of the moves you'll see me where I'm rotating my neck, like an arm bar or even a short lever side plank. All of those are effective at getting that last bit of shoulder flexion. If you've done that, a lot of times you will have full shoulder flexion. If there's still issues or you're having a hard time getting lower cervical rotation, then you might be looking at doing some interventions up at the neck and cranium and the jaw. That goes beyond the scope of this debrief. If you got some questions that you want to learn more about that, we'll just fire away and we can dive into that in a future debrief. But that would be the sequence at which you would drive expansion needed to complete shoulder flexion. To summarize this, because I know we went pretty in depth in this, get your stack first. You need to get lower posterior first and foremost to start the shoulder flexion cascade. If someone's got a loss of ER at the humerus, you'll need to get lower posterior expansion. Low reaches work great for that. If I have ER and I still have a loss of shoulder flexion, if you're losing internal rotation, because you need that in the mid-range of shoulder flexion, that 60 to 120 range, clear ER there. Forward reaches are great for that. If you've cleaned up IR and you're still at a loss of shoulder flexion, you'll need to then expand the uppermost segments of the posterior and anterior thorax. For the posterior thorax, I like side-lying arm bars, any type of trunk rotation. That works really good. Actually, and I should have mentioned this, but for the anterior manubrial expansion, driving humeral extension is very useful for getting the expansion in that area. If you do that, you got horizontal AB and adduction to improve. AB is for posterior expansion, AD is for anterior expansion in the upper segments, T2 to T4. You're still limited. You're then looking at lower cervical rotation. I'm filling this cup up from the bottom up. If you don't have lower cervical rotation, drive cervical rotation with trunk rotation. That works really well. If you still can't get improvements there, you're looking at a cervical cranial issue most likely. You may need to do things to address that. Stay tuned for a debrief in the future that will dive into that. Great question, Corey. There's something on IG that might be a follow-up. Z Dorivier S. Umam. Umam. Hopefully I pronounced you right. Would reaching below 60 allow for the upper posterior thorax to expand as well? Seems that there's no concentric muscle activity in the top parts of the thorax when reaching low. Short answer is yes. 60 is not the magical number. It's just the range that you would go into. So anything 0 to 60 could theoretically drive posterior expansion. Really, if you think about it, anything that's going to drive the scaps into internal rotation is going to be effective at doing that.